So, while Patrick was gallivanting around Egypt, I did a class on the word Allelon. And so Allelon is the word used for one another or each other. So you'd say, well, why is he doing a sermon on this class, or I mean on this topic, since he just did a class on this topic? And so you all who know me very well, you know that I'm sort of an introvert. I'm less of an introvert here than I am in general, in the general public. So, and so being an introvert, this is like really a hard thing for me, the one another versus, because it is interacting with people. And when you would rather not be around people, it's hard to want to interact with people. so, so anyway, so, uh, so this is more for me than probably for anybody here, but if you're an introvert and you don't really like people. And on top of it, I'm an engineer. I'm an engineer, so I mean I've been formally trained to be socially awkward. And so I mean those two things really work well together, in developing a well-rounded, socially awkward person. So so anyway, so this is more for me than it is for anybody else. And but hopefully you might benefit from something I might say. So the one and other verses, they come from the Greek word Allelon, or I think it's pronounced all alone is how you would pronounce it. Or at least that's what the what was that?
Allelon, which is like, yeah, something else.
Yeah, it's not the right word, not the right.
Yeah, just say that one.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, so it's translated one another or each other. Okay, it occurs 100 times. This word occurs 100 times in the New Testament. 59 of those times, the occurrences are essentially instructions teaching us how we should relate to others. And actually, some of them are how we should not relate to others. So there's a few verses that talk about not relating to others. So developing a mindset and a conduct to go with our thinking to these instructions is imperative for us as Christians. It forms the basis of our Christian community here, our Christian community, but it also has a direct impact on how the world sees us. How does the world see us and as Christians? So how does the world see us as Christians? Our conduct to each other and our conduct to them, people in the world, either confirms or denies to the world what we profess to be. And wrong one. John chapter 13, verse 35, which is one of the one another verses, says, "By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So if we have love for one another, they will know that we are disciples. And uh, so, so as I was looking through these verses, Al-Anon is actually quite similar. The qualities that are exhibited are very similar to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 7. So it tells us what love looks like. So it says, "Love is patient, love is kind, and is not jealous. Love does not brag, and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly, it does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. So when you look at the one another verses, they fall into kind of groups. And so I noticed that there were like 7 different qualities that were associated with the one another verses. And kind of, I say qualities, groups of qualities, like, so some of the qualities are like love and good works, welcoming and encouraging one another, humility and submission towards one another, caring and serving towards one another, forgiving and unity, and teaching and admonishing, and confessing and prayer. And these all kind of are very similar to what we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. They all stem from love, you know, love. So we need to have love for, you know, love in the higher level of our lives. So of these verses, there's 59 verses. 53 of these verses are of a positive nature, and 6 of them are of a kind of a negative nature. And so I'm not going to read all of these verses, or we'd be here a long time tonight. But I did want to just kind of highlight some of them. I'm going to list them. So there's going to be a list of the verses, but I'm not going to read them all. So for love and good works, the first one, love and good works, it talks about 18 verses there's 18 verses that speak of love and good works. And 11 of these verses occur in John's writings. So where he frequently him recounting what Jesus says, Jesus frequently reminds us that we need to have an attitude of love towards one another. We need to love one another. And so there's 11 of these verses, but I'd like to read the one from John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. It says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So he also continues in John chapter 15, verse 12 and verse 17, in 1 John chapter 3, verses 11 and 23, 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 and 11 and 12, and then in 2 John chapter 5. The remaining verses, the remaining 7, occur in Romans, Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, and 1 Peter. And just a couple of these, Romans chapter 12, verse 10 says, "Be devoted to one another in brotherly love." So here we have devotion and love that are interconnected with love. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 13, it says, "Serve one another in love." So now we have serving one another in love. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 12, it says, "Make your love increase and overflow for each other." So we are to have love for each other, but we're supposed to have it increasing. We're supposed to be growing in that love and increasing and letting it overflow. And then in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, it says, "Love one another deeply from the heart." So it's not just a superficial thing. It's supposed to be, we're supposed to really, it's not just an outward action. It's what we actually believe and think and feel within within us. The next one is welcoming and encouraging, and there's 14 verses that speak about welcoming and encouraging. The first one, Mark chapter 9, verse 5 says, "Be at peace with each other." So we need to be at peace with one another. So if we have friction with our brothers or with our fellow brothers, we need to work at resolving that and having that peace. In Romans chapter 15, verse 7, it says, "Accept one another, and just as Christ also accepted you." So we need to accept one another, regardless of our differences. We need to be accepting of one another. Okay. And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 12, it says, "Greet one another with a holy kiss." And that actually occurs, I believe, 4 times. So we have 4 times that it says, "Greet one another with a holy kiss." And of course, I think a handshake and a hug is probably good enough, but and it probably has it probably has is a thing that has to do with, you know, culture, but it is. I mean, if we're talking about where things occur in the Bible, greeting one another with the holy kiss, I see people say it occurs one time and they think that that's a command that they need to do something. So here we have greet one another with the holy kiss 4 times. So 4 times is good. And in Colossians chapter 3, verse 12, it says, "Bear with each other." So we're supposed to bear with each other. So if somebody has a little rough edges, we need to bear with them. If someone has a load that they're carrying that we can help with, we need to bear with them. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 11, encourage each other. 1 Corinthians, and then again, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 11 says, "Build each other up." So it's encourage each other, build each other up. So the one another verses, we're supposed to encourage each other. We're supposed to build each other up. That should be our goal, rather than trying, the world wants to tear people down, and we need to be different. We need to build each other up. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24, "Spur one another on to toward love and good deeds." So we need to encourage, if there's something that you're doing that is a good deed, and there's somebody who might need that spurring on, drag them along. Call them up and drag them along to help you do love and good deeds. Spur them on. Spur one another on. And then moving on to so did I forget to advance that slide? I did. Okay. Then the next one, humility and submission. So I was reading all those and you guys didn't see it. Okay, humility and submission, there's 12 verses that deal with that. And there are 9 of them that are positive, and there are 3 of them that are negative. So the positive ones, in Romans chapter 12, verse 10, it says, "Honor one another above yourselves." So that's a hard one, to honor someone else above ourselves. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 2 says, "Be patient, bearing with one another in love." So we are to be patient and bear with one another. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, it says, "Be kind and compassionate toward one another." In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, it says, "Submit to one another out of reverence to Christ." So it tells us why we're submitting. We're not submitting we're not just submitting to submit, we're submitting because Christ, for Christ, uh, because Christ submitted. Christ submitted to God, and we need to submit to Christ, and we need to submit to one another. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, it says, in humility, consider others better than yourselves. How easy is that to do? To consider others better than ourselves. And then in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 9, it says, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. So we're supposed to be hospitable with what God has blessed us with. And then on the negative side, we have Romans chapter 14, verse 13. Stop passing judgment on one another. So don't be judging one another, or within the body. Don't be judging one another, and don't be judging one another outside the body. You don't necessarily know what a person is experiencing or has been through. So it's easy to pass judgment on somebody's actions and not know what the actions, what drove the actions. So, and then in Galatians chapter 5, verse 26, it says, let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other. And then in Colossians chapter 3, verse 9, it says, do not lie to one another. Number 4 is caring and serving. So there's 8 verses which speak of caring and serving, and these are definitely connected with other ones, with other qualities. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 25, it says, have equal concern for each other. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 13, it says, serve one another in love. So we had already seen that one before, serve one another in love. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, it says, be kind and compassionate to one another. And then, so there's a lot of these that have been repeated, like offer hospitality to one another, be patient, bearing with one another in love. The next one is forgiving and unity. So there's 8 verses that speak of forgiving and unity, and 5 of these are from a positive perspective, and 3 of them are from a negative perspective. So John chapter 13, verse 14 says, wash one another's feet. Another thing that's probably cultural, but the idea is there of serving, being hospitable and serving. Romans chapter 12, verse 16 says, live in harmony with one another. And then in Colossians chapter 3, verse 13 says, forgive whatever grievances you have against one another. So forgiving one another. And then from the negative side, Galatians chapter 5, verse 15 says, if you keep on biting and devouring each other, you will be destroyed by each other. So there's 2 one another's there. If you keep biting and devouring, if we're trying to bring people down, and belittle people or make other people look smaller in other people's eyes, then we need to be aware, because that's going to come back and get us. If you keep biting and devouring each other, you will be destroyed by each other. And that is definitely not, that's what the world would expect out of us, to be like them. And that would definitely be a bad example for the world to see. In James chapter 4, verse 11, it says, do not slander one another. And then in James chapter 5, verse 9, it says, do not grumble against each other. Number 6 is teaching and admonishing. There's only 3 verses that are one another verses that are speaking of teaching and admonishing. Romans chapter 15 verse 14 is instruct one another. And then Colossians chapter 3 verse 16, it says teach one another. And then in Colossians, again in Colossians, admonish one another. So teach one another and admonish one another. And then in the seventh one is confessing and prayer. So there's only two verses dealing with confession and prayer. There's obviously a lot of verses in the Bible that are dealing with teaching and admonishing and confessing and prayer, and these other ones, but this is just the ones focused on Allelon. So we have two of them, two verses in James chapter 5 verse 16. It says, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other. So confession and prayer. So that is the one another verses. And, I think that it's important for us to, I know that I didn't cover them all. It would have taken us a long time to go through each one and read and discuss that. And we kind of did that in class, discussing how the practical application of these different verses, these different one another verses. This was just kind of a quick overview of the 59 verses and kind of highlighting some of them quickly. And but it's important, our witness to the world, is important, and it's based on how we treat each other and how we treat people in the world. And I think it's good to just kind of go through these verses and kind of look at what some of them say, and then try to, if we're deficient in something, in an area in our life, if we're deficient in that area, work on it, work on it, and try to more align ourselves with, in our lives, with the life of, with what Christ would have us to be and do and live. And if there's anybody who is in need, is struggling with any of these areas, and in need of any kind of support from the congregation or prayers, um, uh, please come forward as we stand and sing the invitation song.